really wonderful to be part of your academic activity, and I am proud to say that I'm going to chair a session which is going to be taught by Dr. Amia, who is a very good friend of mine, excellent orator also. So, and this is a very important topic, and we we may treat, but our aim is to make others also treat, like neurologist, dermatologist, and other allied specialties. Rheumatologists will treat secondary osteoporosis, but there are specialties where they use glucocorticoids or other agents which can cause osteoporosis. They don't usually treat. So Dr. Amaya will highlight all this, and thank you very much, Dr. Amaya. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Palser, for the kind introduction. And it's always a pleasure to see Dr. Palser, who has been a mentor for us since we were students. And we all look at him for a friendly advice from a father figure whenever we feel that we need one. I also express my gratitude towards all of you, Endocrine Society of Bengal, Dr. Professor Nilanjan Sengupta, Dr. Shaumik Goswami, and each one of you who will be joining, because I always feel that learning is mutual and goes on. I hope I am audible to you and my screen visible. If somebody can please confirm.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Amaya.
Yeah, thank you. I have also posted in the chat box a form of Indian Society of Bone Mineral Research, and me and Dr. Paul sir are in the executive committee of same. Dr. Thomas Paul sir is secretary. I will request all of you to circulate it in Endocrine Society of Bengal, and please, those of you who are not members, please become members. It's an appeal and request both. Now, when we talk about osteoporosis, we have to begin with what exactly is osteoporosis, which means that there is a low bone mass, which is one part of it. And the diagnosis, unfortunately, till now, is based on low bone mass, which is defined as T score worse than minus 2.5, a value that takes a white female in third decade as the center point. But what is also important in osteoporosis is not only the bone mass, but the microarchitectural deterioration of the bone tissue. A fact that I specifically emphasized over here regarding the second part of the definition of osteoporosis, because in most of the causes of secondary osteoporosis, it is the microarchitectural bone
माझ्या याच्यात इयरफोन नाही लागत. तुम्ही लोक जेवून घ्या, मी इकडे जेवते.
which deteriorates. So when we look at how we classify osteoporosis, type 1 is postmenopausal osteoporosis, typically something that is due to loss of gonadal hormonal function in a female. And type 2 osteoporosis is senile osteoporosis, which is typically seen in senior citizens, partly because of a degenerative or a deteriorating bones, to some extent also because of sluggish 1 alpha hydroxylase enzyme. What is our focus today is secondary osteoporosis, where there is an identifiable cause of bone loss. Menopause is also an identifiable cause of bone loss, but that's taken separately. So secondary osteoporosis is a loss of bone caused by identifiable agent or a disease. Of interest to us are going to be endocrinopathies. So I have covered them in little bit more details: drugs, inflammatory disorders, or some other causes. I think if you, in the interest of time, I have tried or will cut short mentioning of these names. I will share my PPT with Dr. Soumik Goswami, and each one of you whom you feel that you need these lists can use them on your own. But Basic causes of secondary osteoporosis include endocrine disorders, gastrointestinal problems, marrow-related diseases, organ transplantation, and a group of vague, unending diseases which we can add on or subtract based on what suits our conscience at that particular point of time. What we will try to discuss is why secondary osteoporosis stands out, the common causes and implications, and at times approach in the endocrine practice. One of the potential challenges that lies in identifying any secondary disorder, let it be osteoporosis, diabetes, or hypertension, is the limits of the evaluation. If you look at me sitting in a private clinic with people coming from all strata, I will also have to be guarded about my evaluation and at times take judicial treatment decisions. But all of us who are basically academicians, let it be practitioners or teachers or people working in institutes, are basically academicians, especially endocrinologists, and we should always keep an eye open to do at least reasonable evaluation, and if possible get more evaluation in patients, because more we evaluate, the incidence of secondary osteoporosis goes higher. The deterioration of the bone loss is much more than what we can see from the bone mass deterioration. So the fracture risk is much more than what can be predicted by your T-score. Most of these elements are not put in your conventional FRAX regime. So whenever you try to formulate a treatment, you eventually end up under treating secondary osteoporosis, and we'll discuss it in the course of time. You might also see that there are multiple elements that come into play, and I have put two case depictions to show how probably each and every patient or most of them attending an endocrine OPD are candidates for a eye view for secondary osteoporosis. One of the important factor is that we all treat osteoporosis not only to show a good score, we treat osteoporosis to prevent a disabling fracture. And so most of these causes of secondary osteoporosis increase muscle weakness, can cause neuropathy, dementia, and each of them can increase the risk of fracture. We all look at guiding principles to treat, and in many of the disorders, these guiding principles are unfortunately missing. However, we must know that if a patient X presents to you for osteoporosis, when you should be critically evaluating that patient. Any person coming early, in a broad definition, any man or a female who is premenopausal coming with osteoporotic fracture or a report of osteoporosis should be evaluated properly. Any pathological fracture, even at the age of 70 years, if some lady who is postmenopausal gets a pathological fracture, especially with a normal BMD, must be evaluated properly. Dysmorphism. Any dysmorphic feature like Cushingoid features, acromegaloid features, features of skeletal abnormalities should be evaluated properly for secondary causes. Body pain or morning stiffness, which indicate an inflammatory disease, should be evaluated more extensively. Whenever a person says that he's losing weight, and I mean it because a lot of causes of secondary osteoporosis, let it be uncontrolled diabetes, let it be hyperthyroidism, let it be occult malignancy, let it be celiac disease or a GI disease, will present as weight loss. So whenever you find weight loss, evaluate that patient of osteoporosis more aggressively. And there are pointers or initial screening. I have again made a list, and each one of you please feel free to look at it, copy it. I will also only make one important mention over here, is that of decreased phosphorus level. So any person in whom, while evaluating a basic evaluation, so you will definitely get a basic evaluation like getting calcium, phosphorus, creatinine, alkaline phosphatase, vitamin D, PTH, thyroid function, hemogram, and 24-hour urinary calcium excretion for practically all patients where you find osteoporosis. in general also. But when you find that the phosphorus level is low, it could be as simple as vitamin D deficiency. But remember, that is also one of the causes of secondary osteoporosis or a bone showing poor T score. And so you should never take low phosphorus lightly. Then your clinical evaluation gives you certain clues based on which you can do further tests, like hypogonadism in a male. You can see by secondary sexual characters or the patient mentioning of sexual dysfunction. Hyperthyroidism, you can see the signs. Hyperparathyroidism, you can elicit signs, or on discussion you can get some clues. Vitamin D deficiency is common. Hemochromatosis is again one of the important causes which is visible by history as well as some pointers in examination. Cushing's, all of us endocrinologists cannot afford to miss, and multiple myeloma. Any senior citizen, postmenopausal female or a male presenting with anemia, multiple myeloma should strike you, particularly if there is a raised ESR. I am putting a chart of how you should be evaluating a postmenopausal woman in the center. So definitely these are the minimalistic approach. In any postmenopausal woman, when you treat for osteoporosis, you will get the parameters that we discussed. You may not do 125 hydroxyvitamin D. It's from Nature's Review. I have mentioned it as it is, but you may skip 125 and do the remaining. When a gentleman gets osteoporosis, you definitely add looking at testosterone levels, SHBG, PSA in addition. And when a premenopausal female gets osteoporosis, you include gonadal axis evaluation definitely, but also look at certain other causes like malabsorption, anorexia nervosa, rheumatic disease, and detailed evaluation of HPA axis. So let us try to look at some generalizations. The earlier the age of onset, the more will be the hit on the bone and more severe will be the osteoporosis. Longer the duration of the disease, more severe will be osteoporosis. More severe is the disease, more florid is the cortisol burden, more higher the glucocorticoid doses, more severe the osteoporosis. More bone unfriendly the treatment, more severe the disease. The treatment of all of these causes of secondary osteoporosis begins with treating the underlying cause, and we must not deny bone protective therapies. I'll come at some points where they were equally important, but to set the ball rolling, we start with a lady who is a 54-year-old female, known case of SLE, presented with a hip fracture, and on initial evaluation, she was quite stable. She had stigmata of long-term glucocorticoid use, and on inquiry, she had been diabetic and hypertensive for 8 years. She's non-smoker and no past history of fracture. She has been diagnosed with SLE 26 years ago, had taken glucocorticoids. She had nephropathy 10 years ago and has been on pulse therapies of steroids on and off. She is diabetic and hypertensive and postmenopausal to add to all the insults. So she has long-term steroid use, arthritis, postmenopausal state, diabetes, and nephropathy. Practically 5 causes of secondary osteoporosis. And then interplay factors which intermittently come like glucocorticoid pulses, pregnancy, menopause, diabetes and steroid use, glucocorticoids and other medications, and things like myopathy, vision impairment, which she invariably will have, and frailness, contributing to not only the osteoporosis but the falls. Now, when we put her in fracs, and this is an Indian fracs that I have applied. When you put a Caucasian fracs, the fracture risk, especially of a major osteoporotic fracture, is much more. But the Indian fracs value is much lesser. And this is only to emphasize that conventionally we start treatment when the major osteoporotic fracture risk is more than 10%. But you can clearly see that here it is less. But you can clearly see the secondary factors. And I am sure that each one of you sitting in the OPD will probably give your best for this patient in treating osteoporosis. And meanwhile, let us try to look at the mechanisms of osteoporosis by glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are, reduce the function of osteoblasts and promote the osteoclastic recruitment and differentiation as well as function. The added insult is of reduction of the local growth factors, promoting the rank ligand and reducing OPG. Also, they are causes of secondary hypogonadism. They reduce GI calcium absorption and urinary calcium excretion. So as Dr. Paul mentioned, one disorder while introducing the topic, it is the steroid exposure, endogenous or exogenous, as a most common cause or one of the most significant cause of secondary osteoporosis. So what we should know in glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis is beyond the secondary cause, the bone loss starts quite early and is maximum in first 3 to 6 months. The fracture risk increases as early as 3 months and is dose dependent. To add to the irony, even if you audit your own institute, I am not saying endocrine department, but all departments taken together, hardly 1 in 4 patients will be treated properly. And this study from Vansta tells us about the relative risk of fractures at various glucocorticoid doses. You can clearly see that the fracture risk increases at vertebra as early as dose of 2.5 milligrams a day. And as the dose goes on incrementally increasing, the risk of spine fracture is much more in patients on glucocorticoid therapy as compared to hip fracture, though both are equally relevant. And then if you look at the time of the fractures, usually the fracture risk is more in the initial 3 to 6 months and then plateaus, indicating a rapid bone loss and increased fracture risk. And so the initiation of glucocorticoid therapy should be accompanied by assessment of bone density, calcium supplementation, and addition of anti-resorptive as the need be. And I am summarizing the 4 guidelines. The most commonly used is one by American College of Rheumatology, but EULAR, IOF, and National Osteoporosis Guideline Group also have made statements. I'll give you the key points. So anybody with glucocorticoid use more than 2.5 milligrams a day and duration more than 3 months is at risk of bone loss. All adults above 40 years or those below 40 years with risk factors must get a BMD. Though they have said within 6 months, I think we should ensure it at the beginning of glucocorticoid therapy and then once in 2 years at least. All glucocorticoid therapies increase the risk of major osteoporotic fracture by 15% and risk of hip fracture by approximately 20%. Calcium and vitamin D should be supplemented in the beginning, and probably ACR guidelines are most preferred because they give a clear indication of whom to be treated. So all patients with fragility fracture on glucocorticoids need treatment. All patients with age more than 70 essentially need treatment. By treatment, I don't mean only calcium and vitamin D, but also anti-resorptives. Age between 40 to 70 with major osteoporotic fracture needs treatment. Age below 40 with Z-score below 3 or a daily dose more than 7.5 of prednisolone equivalent needs treatment. And patients as early as 30 to 40 years on very high dose also need treatment. So anybody above 30 needs a very critical eye to treat. Below 30, we are reserved in giving anti-resorptives or anabolics for the simple reason that the peak bone mass is yet to be achieved. But in those age groups also, sometimes we have to take a rational call. By and large, oral biphosphonates become the first line therapy, but sometimes with severe osteoporosis and vertebral fractures, injectable therapies are also used. Even teriparatide and denosumab are getting more and more recognized as useful medications. And treatment ideally should be till the duration of glucocorticoid therapy, except that if you are dealing with baseline osteoporosis, don't stop the treatment at the stopping of glucocorticoid therapy. You need to extend the treatment till 5 years as per the guidelines. And this is a study published in Lancet in 2009, which looked at oral versus intravenous bisphosphonate. And it clearly gives hands-on victory to zoledronate for all sites, restricting the patients on glucocorticoid therapy. So we come back to our case. She's a postmenopausal lady, and I must tell you that after 65 is a criteria to screen for osteoporosis. So she is a person with secondary osteoporosis, does not have a previous fracture as of now, except for this episode. She's on high dose of prednisolone. We don't know the duration of therapy. Cumulative dose has been high and the BMD is expected is poor. But I must tell you that the fracture risk in this particular patient is much, much worse than seen by the BMD or the FRAC score. And so it was decided to give her on zoledronate. She had taken zoledronate before, but it was decided that she should be given zoledronate as an initial therapy along with calcium and vitamin D supplementation. It was planned to reassess the BMD and also discuss with a specialist. She was also told to stop proton pump inhibitors, and physiotherapy was started. So all my friends who are listening, your job does not end like your diabetes prescription starts with diet and exercise. Your osteoporosis prescription starts with physiotherapy and support systems to prevent falls, calcium and vitamin D supplementation, and then your anti-resorptive or an anabolic, and then a clear advice that these medicines should be avoided. We discussed about glucocorticoids. We will discuss few others later. These medications should be avoided as much as possible, and a plan to reassess the BMD, and that completes your osteoporosis prescription for any case. So moving on from steroids, and I have skipped the diagnosis of Cushing's because I know you all know that. We move on to another common OPD patient who is a 52-year-old lady presented with type 2 diabetes, no family history of fracture, no glucocorticoid use, and having a BMD score of minus 2.3 at lumbar spine and at hip minus 2.1. So she is a typical diabetic patient coming with a forearm fracture, which is not an absolute indication where you should be doing further. She's 52-year-old lady, so does not come in the classic 65 or above, and she's diabetic and hypertensive. But then if you look at her prescription, she's on metformin, pioglitazone, empalina, glargine, telmisartan, atorvastatin, duloxetine, gabapentin, pantoprazole, and occasionally citalopram. This is the story of most of our diabetic patients with lot of power-packed OADs, diuretic invariably as one of the major antihypertensives, and then nerve protective therapy. So any patient with diabetes and neuropathy is at high risk of fall. Any patient with diabetes and insulin is at high risk of fall. Any patient with diabetic and vision disturbances is at high risk of fall. And so we outline the prescription showing all the therapies or highlighting all the therapies, let it be pioglitazone, duloxetine, pantoprazole, gabapentin as risk factors for secondary osteoporosis, and glargine as a risk factor for falls. Now let us try to understand in a minute what exactly your pioglitazone does and why we are worried about osteoporosis, because we typically prescribe them in thin diabetics, but elderly thin diabetics invariably have osteoporosis, and pioglitazone shifts the mesenchymal progenitor cell towards the adipocyte lineage, preventing their differentiation into osteoblasts, and as a result of which there is much more risk of fractures. You can see that the risk of fracture with metformin and glyburide is much lesser as compared to the risk of fracture with rosiglitazone. But TZDs are not the only cause of fractures. There are many more, and we discussed some of them. Now moving on from type 2 to type 1 diabetes, and this is our own study. This was my dissertation about looking at bone density and its determinants in type 1 diabetes. And what we realized is celiac disease is a major blow to the bone in type 1 diabetes. Insulin deficiency, other way of looking at it was poorly controlled type 1 diabetics As a result of that, they had low IGF-1 levels, and that correlated with bone loss the most significantly. Vitamin D deficiency was one of the causes, hypogonadism, renal failure, and early age of onset. So all of these factors in type 1 diabetes. So whenever, even if you look at a type 1 diabetes in 20 to 30 years of age, and if you realize that all these factors are there, and mark my words, whenever you see a type 1 diabetes who is short in stature, he must be cared for osteoporosis early. A lot of studies have looked at BMD and diabetes, and most of them have concluded that type 1 diabetes is a risk factor for osteoporosis, whereas type 2 diabetes may not cause osteoporosis, but it increases the fracture risk. And so the FRAX falls short of estimating the fracture risk in type 2 diabetes. So let us try to look at the FRAX and the fracture risk. And what you can see that the lower line represents a non-diabetic patient with fracture risk. And then you look at diabetic without insulin, and then you look at a diabetic patient with insulin. And what you can clearly see that there is a linear increase in risk of fractures as compared to incidence of fractures as compared to that of a conventional FRAX score. And currently our FRAX algorithm falls short. So whenever you calculate a T-score of a diabetic patient, you make it worse by 0.5 to 0.6, and that extrapolates with the fracture risk in the type 2 diabetic patient. So any type 2 diabetic, if the T-score is minus 2.3 at lumbar spine, like in our patient, we have to read it as minus 2.8 and get the FRAX. And that is rough extrapolation. But AAC has included type 1 and type 2 diabetes as causes of osteoporosis in adults. And this is the secondary causes of osteoporosis in adults as per the AAC recommendations published in 2017. So fracture risk is more. False obesity, thiazolidinediones all contribute to type 2 diabetes and fractures. Intensive glycemic control does not increase fractures, but poor control does. And osteopathy in diabetes correlates with microvascular disease. So any type 2 diabetes with neuropathy, with eye problems, think of fractures, consider more aggressive bone protection and evaluation. And standard guidelines for fracture prevention do apply, and it is an endocrinologist's eye which can prevent our lot of diabetic patients from fracturing. And if a fracture has occurred or if a fracture risk is high, patients should be given pharmacological treatment. And current therapies have not been well studied in a diabetic specific manner. I think secondary osteoporosis is an evolving topic. Over a period of time, we'll come to know and learn more. And I'm sure that 5 years later, Dr. Soumik Goswami may call me again for delivering one more lecture for you on secondary osteoporosis, and I'll be happy to do that. But the good clinical practice include bone density as a part of evaluation in type 1 diabetics and type 2 diabetics, considering diabetes as a risk factor, looking at fracture prevention, always in the treatment of type 2 diabetics, consider bone health and vitamin D repletion. Moving on from diabetes to something which we have been clearly correlating with the bone, and that's gonad. And we all know that testosterone deficiency in a male causes osteoporosis. Most importantly, because testosterone is converted to estrogen and protects the bone, but testosterone also reduces growth factors on the osteoblasts and has a direct effect on the androgen receptors situated on the osteoblasts. And we all know about estrogen. There are two distinct patterns of bone loss seen in male hypogonadism. One where the aromatase activity is good. And typically when you see a male with hypogonadism and gynecomastia, usually the bone health does not deteriorate much because they have good aromatase activity. And as a result of that, estrogen levels are relatively higher, and as a result of that, the osteoporosis risk is relatively lower. When you see a second pattern of osteoporosis where aromatase activity is poor, there is loss of bone mass and low BMD and much higher risk of osteoporosis. And then there have been multiple studies which have looked at testosterone replacement and lumbar spine BMD. This is the recent one as a meta-analysis published by Zhang in Endocrine 2020. And they realized that there was no difference in the bone health of hypogonadic males who were given testosterone therapy, neither for total body, nor for spine, nor at hip. But there have been again lot of studies done, and this is a paper published from Shingara which mentioned various studies, and you can see that at least some of them have noted improvement at the lumbar spine. However, the improvement with testosterone therapy does not always mean that the bones will be good. So I am taking you back to a paper from Zhang, which concluded that testosterone therapy improves sexual function and maybe musculoskeletal health convincingly, but falls short of convincing us that testosterone therapy improves the bone health. And this is again one of the landmark study done in androgen deficiency in aging males. It was a phase 3 trial done on 228 males where denosumab was given for first 12 months and then again continued in the intervention group, whereas placebo was given for first 12 months followed by denosumab, and then it was tried to look at the BMD, and you can clearly see that a glaring increase in the BMD that is seen in the denosumab group as compared to the placebo arm. And then we look at what happened to the groups. The upper lines, which are not dotted, show a denosumab group showing progressive rise in the BMD, whereas the dotted lines show a rise most remarkably after 12 months, showing that denosumab does lot of good to the bone density in aging males with testosterone deficiency and osteoporosis. And then I was tempted to put this slide because androgen deprivation is seen more and more in today's world because of the prostate cancer patients, and you can clearly see that all the interventions result in the loss of bones. And this androgen deficiency causes decreased level of estrogen and testosterone, decreases the BMD, and increases the relative risk of fracture by 50% in the first 5 to 10 years. The greatest BMD loss is noted in the first year, and whenever this is discontinued, and mind you, this very rarely happens, especially in prostate cancer patients, discontinuing androgen deprivation is very difficult. So we are going to see more and more these patients in practice, androgen deprivation in a male and aromatase inhibitors in a females, and it is our responsibility to support our oncology colleagues. But this particular guideline published in Journal of Clinical Oncology is the only guideline dealing with osteoporosis in men on androgen deprivation therapy by Cancer Center Ontario, and they recommend treatment to be offered on the basis of BMD and the fracture risk, clearly giving denosumab as a first line therapy. So this is one of those places where denosumab is a first line and not bisphosphonates, and the evidence comes from the ADAM study that we saw. Now moving on from androgen deprivation and male hypogonadism to another factor which is related, you can call it as drug-induced osteoporosis, malignancy-related osteoporosis, or as a cause of osteoporosis in most of these females who have attained menopause or more, because aromatase inhibitors are commonly given in breast cancer patients, and they increase the bone loss 2 to 4 times, and the fracture risk goes up remarkably. 1 in 5 to 10 women prescribed aromatase inhibitors experiences osteoporotic fracture. And if you look at the huge number of women going through breast cancer therapies, very few of them are actually properly treated for osteoporosis. Bone loss reduces after the AI use is stopped, but I must tell you that AI use is minimum for 5 years, and there are attempts to extend this AI use for 10 years. And we all know that AI aromatase inhibitor related bone loss is due to the lack of effect of estrogen or estrogen deprivation and loss of trophic effect on the bone. And again, this is one of the approach to patients on AI. So when you find that a lady is on AI and a T-score is below 2, you consider giving her bisphosphonate. If the T-score is below 1.5, but she is above 65 years with low BMI, with family history of hip fracture or glucocorticoid use or smoking, you should still consider giving therapeutic bisphosphonates. So you can use this algorithm for decision making. There have been a lot of studies that have been done for ladies on aromatase inhibitors, and most studied molecule is zoledronate. One of the additional benefits of zoledronate in patients on aromatase inhibitors is that it independently improves the disease-free survival, as revealed by this paper from Coleman in Journal of Bone Oncology. And then this was a very interesting study called as a Z-FAST trial, which looked at 5 years in intervention group starting zoledronate on day 1, and in the placebo group, they were followed up by annual BMDs, and whenever the BMD dropped or there was evidence of bone loss, zoledronate was given to only those who achieved that criteria. And you can clearly see that giving zoledronate upfront improved the BMD, whereas delayed group experienced bone loss. The fracture risk was also much more in those who were deprived of the uh, and of the zoledronate earlier. So what we conclude is that upfront introduction of zoledronate in patients with breast cancer on aromatase inhibitor therapy protects the bones remarkably. And then if you look at various aspects and their magnitude of bone loss, and you can clearly see that AI plus gonadotropin releasing agonist, androgen deprivation, and ovarian failure are the most common hormonal causes of bone loss, which are to some extent overlapping with oncology also. Now coming to one short aspect of the drug-induced osteoporosis, because we saw a lot of drug-induced osteoporosis also, in addition to endocrinopathies like glucocorticoids, androgen deprivation, and aromatase inhibitors. Proton pumps, proton pump inhibitors cause bone loss by actually inhibiting the osteoclast proton pump, causing reduced bone turnover. What is more important is that whenever proton pump inhibitors are used along with bisphosphonates, the bone, the effect of bisphosphonates is blunted. And where we should always remember, we many times loosely give bisphosphonates in proton pump inhibitors in patients on bisphosphonates so as to curb the hyperacidity because of them. Bone loss is clearly documented in men than women, and the fracture risk increases in both men and women. There is no clear-cut guideline, and preventing the proton pump inhibitors use or rationalizing their use is very, very important need of the day. They can cause many problems in addition to osteoporosis, like uh, even kidney problems and all. So we should be very, very vigilant while prescribing. The lowest possible dose of PPIs should be given. We should consider de-prescribing because millions and millions of our population is taking proton pump inhibitors from all OPDs, I must say, including the endocrine OPD also. And you can at times consider switch to H2 blocker. And whenever you supplement calcium, usually calcium carbonate does not get absorbed properly. So either you dissolve the calcium carbonate tablet and give, or you give calcium citrate tablet. Now moving on to one of the common endocrinopathy, which we will briefly touch in our journey of this secondary osteoporosis, is thyroid disorders. Hypothyroidism, in particular, if it has early onset, can reduce the growth velocity and reduce bone mineralization. And so sometimes you can get low bone mass, but usually it is the hyperthyroidism that is terrible to the bone, causing reduced bone mass and increased fragility. And hyperthyroidism damages the bone by direct resorptive effect of the thyroid hormones on the bone. Along with that, there is reduced conversion of 25-hydroxyvitamin D to calcitriol in the kidneys, and you can get slight hypocalcemia because of that, but you can also get mild hypercalcemia because of the augmented bone loss that is seen by thyroid hormones. Also, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, I must tell you, are autoimmune diseases that are associated with many other endocrinopathies, most notably celiac disease. So whenever you see a hypothyroidism who is reducing weight, or a hyperthyroidism who is normalizing the thyroid function but still not gaining weight, definitely you must consider that that particular person can have celiac autoimmunity and or underlying Addison's disease, and screen more aggressively for these concomitant autoimmunities. So I'm sorry for the misnomer. I wanted to say primary hyperthyroidism. So we move on from thyroid to parathyroid. And we all know that parathyroid is a main regulator of calcium in the body. Parathyroid glands causes bone resorption and rise in the serum calcium. Whenever there is a reduction in serum calcium, the trigger is sent, PTH secretion increases, and there is a rise in the serum calcium. It also has an effect on the kidneys, reducing calcium excretion and reabsorbing more calcium, as well as it promotes gut calcium absorption. Predominantly, it was thought that the cortical bone of the forearms and the extremities is affected in primary hyperparathyroidism, and this particular photo shows that wonderfully. This is from an article of Blisken's in 2006. Blisken has also written a JCM article in 2018 on primary hyperparathyroidism, and you can see that the loss of bone density is profound in the forearm bones. However, it was thought that hyperparathyroidism basically causes forearm and extremity fractures, which changed by this particular paper from Dr. Sandeep Khosla, which showed that not only the forearms but vertebra also fractured equally or slightly more than expected. So if you look at the expected fractures and the observed fractures, they were more at all sites, almost double at forearm, but almost 3.5 times at the vertebrae. So bone density is less at forearms, though also at vertebrae it is less, but much more is the fracture risk at the vertebrae. And this was further explained by this article in 2013, which showed that even the BMD can predict it less, but the trabecular bone loses much more in quality, which was seen by the QCT. So we are increasingly having QCTs and trabecular bone scores available, and they can help us gauge the bone health much better, and maybe next decade they will be the norm. So Dr. Soumik remember me to call after 5 years. And then we look at primary hyperparathyroidism increasing TH17 and further contributing to bone loss by multiple pathways. Obviously, the treatment of primary hyperparathyroidism should be removal of the parathyroid adenoma, and treating that improves the bone density remarkably. We should possibly defer using anti-resorptives before surgery, because of the simple reason that we want the bone improvement also to go fast, and bisphosphonates and anti-resorptives block that. So it's always better to defer unless the hypercalcemia is severe or there are some compelling reasons for that. And this is regarding growth hormone and bone from the house of Anna Maria Colau, published in JCM 1919, where they classified GHD in adults with panhypopituitarism or multiple pituitary hormone deficiencies, where other hormones were replaced, and looked at bone health and realized that bone health is poorest in patients who have more severe GHD, and they may be an indication of growth hormone therapy, but because of the lack of intervention, it fell short. So we discussed about endocrinopathies, we discussed about drug-induced osteoporosis, and these are the major causes of secondary osteoporosis. And in next last 10-12 minutes or so, we'll try to look at miscellaneous causes, and most notable of them are gastrointestinal disorders like celiac disease, and inflammatory bowel disease. Basically, they cause osteoporosis by nutritional deficiency, but also by inflammation. And some of them, like IBD, need glucocorticoids. And that also contributes to bone loss. It is totally a gray area that who needs to be screened and who needs to be treated. And similarly, what is the treatment? Whether it is a treatment of celiac disease and IBD that will improve the bone, or you need some anti-resorptive. But what I want to emphasize is that these could be significantly prevalent when we screen high risk, like male population or premenopausal females, for osteoporosis. And calcium and vitamin D replacement can be suboptimal, because if you give them orally, they may not still be calcium and vitamin D replete. And so monitoring of vitamin D at least is relevant in this particular population. Obviously, rational use of anti-resorptives and anabolics should be done as they need be. Bariatric surgeries, I feel, have plateaued. I don't know what other colleagues of mine feel, but at one end there was a huge trend for getting bariatric surgeries, which has now reduced, and maybe a reasonable number are getting it, but not exponentially rising. But it does cause bone loss by nutritional deficiencies. Patients reduce weight, and a part of it is also bone. Patients with bariatric surgery also experience sarcopenia, and sometimes adipokine milieu is not supportive to the bones. So it is important as a part of a guideline also to monitor BMD along with body composition on an annual basis and consider rational use of therapies. Again, this is a group where you might need to give vitamin D injectably if it doesn't come up by oral supplementation. Eating disorders like anorexia nervosa are common in young females, and so any young female who is lean and thin, you should be vigilant about them. And what harms in a young lean and thin female is a reduced lean body mass, hypogonadism, that is lack of menses, IGF-1 levels which are low, and relative hypercortisolemia, which could be seen in severe anorectics, and these correlate with poor bone health. What helps is better nutrition, weight gain. I must tell you a curious thing, that oral estrogen has not been shown to improve bones in anorexia. So whenever you are giving oral estrogens, probably it may not work. And the explanation for that is it blunts the already low IGF-1. So what works is transdermal estrogen, and some studies of IGF-1 with E2 has been done. And obviously exercise. So anorectics are known to exercise heavily, and that has shown to preserve their hip bones particularly. Hepatic diseases can cause osteoporosis by malabsorption, by interfering with activation of vitamin D, by themselves causing frailness, by associated hypogonadism, ethanol consumption, then hemochromatosis, and sometimes glucocorticoids used in them. I just enumerated the possible causes. One of the treatment limitations in hepatic osteodystrophy is bisphosphonates cannot be given if the liver dysfunction is severe, and we have to be guarded in giving anabolics also in patients with liver disease. So we have to be really careful in treating them. And then we move at CKD. And chronic kidney disease basically is a interplay of bone turnover. So there could be high turnover disease, there could be a dynamic disease, and it is this turnover that needs to be handled. And stabilization of calcium and vitamin D parameters, including PTH, was much focused on, to the extent that KDIGO guidelines, except for the latest version, have fell short of even recommending a BMD in patients with CKD. So the Nephrology Society has completely ignored BMD, and the current recommendation also says that BMD should be done in CKD patients when indicated, saying that this is a recommendation with very weak strength of evidence. Denosumab has been used predominantly in patients with high bone turnovers with PTH levels which are high and bone specific alkaline phosphatase which is documented high, predominantly to reduce the bone resorption. But at times parathyroidectomy, especially if the PTH level is above 900, has also been used. And this is again a new consensus on managing CKD and MBD, again an algorithm based which included DEXA and then gave predominant focus on other things like stabilizing the calcium parameters, stabilizing the acid base balance, stabilizing the PTH, and giving some window of opportunity to pharmacological treatment, most notably denosumab. Hematological diseases, I will mention two, mainly hemochromatosis and beta thalassemia. Hemochromatosis is iron deposition, so it can cause liver failure, vitamin D deficiency because of the hyperpigmented skin, and secondary hypogonadism, and thereby contribute to osteoporosis. Again, chelation therapy over here helps, but a rational use of treatment is also needed. Beta thalassemia usually causes osteoporosis by hypogonadism, hypopituitarism, sometimes hypoparathyroidism also. And again, in this case, even if you can use chelation therapy, you can give blood transfusions, but at times you may have to use bisphosphonates. What is important is sensitization amongst hematological community to assess bones and take treatment as and when needed. One thing amongst, I would say, either hematological or malignancy causes which we can never forget is myeloma. And myeloma can cause osteoporosis by stimulating the osteoclasts and increasing the rank ligand. And as a result of that, myeloma is very, very common cause of secondary osteoporosis to the extent that occult myeloma becomes a searchable reason in any patient with secondary osteoporosis, particularly if there is anemia. Zolendronate is given monthly in myeloma protocols and then in reduced frequency, and denosumab has again gained relevance. Fractures can be prevented by cement augmentation, and these patients frequently need that. And this is again another positional paper in Lancet Oncology by Trepos et al. One of the pieces which guides all the stakeholders to take care of osteoporosis in myeloma in a holistic manner. Systemic mastocytosis is recommended as a part of screening for secondary osteoporosis in many guidelines, and it is a mast cell hyperplasia usually by genetic driven genetically, and serum tryptase levels have been used to identify and the clinical features. And this is, though rare, is an identifiable cause of secondary osteoporosis to mention. Renal tubular acidosis, tubular acids disorders, and idiopathic hypercalciuria. I think we recognize them in childhood if they are severe, but milder variants have been increasingly found as a cause of osteoporosis in certain studies which looked at aggressive investigation for secondary osteoporosis. Moving on to the last part of secondary osteoporosis, that is rheumatic disease, and I took it last because, as Dr. Paul said, rheumatology is one of the fraternity other than endocrinology that looks at osteoporosis sincerely, and we can see that multiple factors contribute to osteoporosis, which might include the severe disease, severe inflammation, metabolic factors like vitamin D deficiency, associated thyroid problems, hypogonadism that is common along with them, and medications, anti-glucocorticoids, cyclophosphamide, etc., can cause osteoporosis in SLE. As a prototype, we all know that rheumatoid arthritis is also one of the diseases. Again, similar causes hold true, and it's also mentioned in FACS. I put this interesting paper just as a trivia, which looked at improvement in bone density as a result of tocilizumab being used as a treatment for methotrexate resistant active rheumatoid arthritis. And tocilizumab resulted in statistically significant improvement in bone density in rheumatoid arthritis patients, particularly when they had osteopenia. And I must say, oh my God, how bad time these people may be having. The indicated people who need tocilizumab, they probably will not be getting it at all. So population-based studies have shown higher prevalence of osteoporosis in patients with rheumatological disorders and vertebral abnormalities. HIV is an unrecognized cause. We have many patients with HIV now living as with chronic disease. In my residency, people used to be like looking at or waiting for when their time will come for a severe disaster or death. But now PLH, or person living with HIV and AIDS, has become a norm. People are surviving for decades, and osteoporosis can cause predominantly due to HIV, but also due to antiretroviral therapy, and at sometimes as a result of the therapeutics and the immunological changes, as well as other factors like renal failure and endocrinopathies associated with HIV. There are causes like osteogenesis imperfecta and cystic fibrosis, or as we know is a defect in collagen, and cystic fibrosis causes a lot of problems like pancreatic insufficiency, diabetes, sex hormone deficiency, physical inactivity, chronic infections which are common in them, and corticosteroids. All of them can contribute to osteoporosis. One of the causes which I will typically say that whenever you see somebody with a poor dentition, always screen for osteoporosis. Anybody I at least do, if the person is beyond fourth or fifth decade with poor dentition, I screen for osteoporosis. Hypophosphatemia is a reason. Severe variants present very early, but milder variants are common. We may not always be able to get genetic screening, but a low alkaline phosphatase level on examination or evaluation and a poor dentition are indicators that these may be harboring uh, poor bones. So to summarize, secondary osteoporosis is more common than foreseen. The more we look, the more we get, and the more we get, the more we can prove to other specialties that we are good, and they will also realize the importance of endocrine referral, as well as they will get sensitized. Even usual post-menopausal female can have secondary contributory factors. So if you look at the case scenarios that I had put forward, probably you will be convinced that most of the osteoporosis patients have some reversible factors. Even if you don't look at them as secondary causative factors, try to look at them as reversible factors. More extensive evaluation is needed in men and premenopausal women, premenopausal men and women. Uh, More extensive evaluation is indicated in men and premenopausal women. The severity depends on age of onset, severity of disease, and the ongoing treatments. And treating of the underlying cause is important, but not the all treatment. I mean, treating the underlying cause is not the be all and end all of the treatment. What we need is a comprehensive brain work to make the patient's bones fit. I will also like to make 2 or 3 notable mentions which I have not covered. I have not covered dementia, which may or may not cause osteoporosis but increases falls. I have not covered COPD, which is common cause because of the glucocorticoid use. And I have not covered pregnancy-induced osteoporosis, which is sometimes detrimental in a young female and is a cause of sometimes rarely a fracture also. Beyond that, I have tried to cover whatever I could and do a job so that all of you, my student friends, are benefited somewhere or the other. And I thank each one of you for your patient listening. I always feel happy when I hear about West Bengal, because I work at Bhaktivedanta Hospital, which has a center in Mayapur. Dr. Shubhankar Chaudhary always promises me that he will call me to West Bengal, but he has not yet called me. So when lockdown is over, I will request Dr. Soumik to give me an opportunity on a lighter note. But I am grateful to all of you. And if there are any questions, please feel free to come up with them. And I also like to invite comments from Dr. Thomas Paulsers, who has always been enlightening us on the topic.
Thank you, Dr. Amir. It was excellent, actually. So it's a big essay question, and it's really nice. You covered almost all the causes, and it is really wonderful. And I think, as you mentioned, we can take the endocrinologists and endocrinology students from West Bengal are intellectually very, very active. So we want to look at their comments and their knowledge information. Dr. Soumik is there, Professor Dr. Nilanjan is there. Any comments?
Well, I would rather ask your opinion and maybe Amea also to comment. We know that pioglitazone still is a cheap, effective insulin sensitizer, though its use has come down because of other concerns, mainly heart failure and bladder cancer. But then there would be a subset of patients who would benefit from pioglitazone. Now, if these patients are elderly, especially a postmenopausal woman, so what's your take? Just because the patient is a postmenopausal female, would you not prescribe pioglitazone? Or if you prescribe, what would be your workup for osteoporosis?
So, actually, your question has got two components. If somebody postmenopausal, especially after 15 years, 60, the risk of osteoporosis is about 40% across the country, and the risk of fractures also as high as 30%. So, risk of fracture means asymptomatic vertebral fractures. So, in that case, I may be little hesitant to start, especially after 60. But between 50 to 60, somebody on a stable dose, and there is one study we could find, because this question was asked in RSSDI, is there any dose dependence? And there is one study, they looked at if the dosage is less than 15. Some of the patients will be on 7.5 milligram of pioglitazone. It may not be as harmful as a 30 milligram, but that's only one study. Other than that, we don't have much information about the dose dependence or how how to avoid. But especially after 60, we tend to avoid, sir, unless patient is on stable and we can monitor. That is my take.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think very nicely put forward, sir. I will say that I will tell the patient that I have two options for you. One of them is considering insulin, and another is taking pioglitazone, and maybe spend few minutes explaining her both, and respect the patient's decision. Finally, equipoise.
Right. I think Niladri has a question. Amia, you can
Yes,
look
sir.
at the chat box.
So the question from Dr. Niladri is, how often a patient on bisphosphonate for secondary osteoporosis needs to be monitored? And is there any role of drug holiday in secondary osteoporosis? I'll just mention that bisphosphonates are the medications which have life in the bone, and that is very, very individual. We will definitely have to give drug holiday after 3 to 5 years, and then annually look at a resorptive marker and BMD, and then take a call on when to reinitiate. I personally don't have lot of patients who are on glucocorticoids, and then I have given drug holiday and then tried to look at. But at least in couple of patients what I have seen, because what is available to us is urinary NTX, which is easily available in Mumbai and done in commercial labs, that even within 1 year after 3 years of Zolendonate, their urinary NTXs were high. But I cannot get any documented supporting literature for same. So I will also invite comments from Dr. Paul sir on that.
It's a good question. See, what we are doing, we have a good cohort of glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis. Doctor, you asked an excellent question. So what we have both P1NP and CTX, both are available. We do CTX, that is the resorption marker, which is commercialized as a beta cross lab. We keep initially, and also we monitor. One important thing is, which I forgot to tell you, is the alkaline phosphatase. We find in subjects, if the lab cutoff is between 40 to 125, and if the alkaline phosphatase, of course, Dr. Amia has mentioned in hypophosphatasia, if the total alkaline phosphatase is less than 55, we have some kind of reservation in starting bisphosphonate because it will come down very fast and make bone little adynamic. So in secondary osteoporosis on bisphosphonate, if the CTX comes down by 50%, we tend to give a holiday. Usually it happens at the end of 1 to 1.5 years. So we find that initially maybe 800, it comes down to 400 or 300 with oral bisphosphonate. Then we tend to give a holiday of 3 to 6 months. Our monitoring frequency is 3 to 6 months. And also, if somebody on a chronic bisphosphonate, that is a long term, more than 2 years, our DEXA machine, we all know there is a atypical fracture assessment is there. So, or we also, if it is not available, we'll do an X-ray pelvis with the upper two-third of the femur to look for the thickening or any peaking. We have seen patients, some patients, it can occur, adynamicity can occur as early as 2 years. So if somebody has got a thigh pain on bisphosphonate or a gluteal pain on bisphosphonate, better to do X-ray pelvis with the upper two-third of the femur to look for peaking or significant cortical thickness.
I think, sir, that was very, very useful. Maybe, I mean, that was one of the reasons why they also found that atypical fractures were much more common amongst Asians as compared to Caucasians.
Yes.
It's a very, very valuable observation that you shared, sir. There is one more question that's also interesting from Dr. Ajitesh regarding should we start anti-osteoporosis treatment for all patients with endogenous Cushing's? I think what is needed is individualized decision making, assessing the BMD, and maybe give it after 30 and below 30 only in severe disease and proven poor BMD. I like to invite Dr. Thomas Paul sir's view
I
on
fully
that.
agree with you. We do all parameters, including bone turnover. We look at a vertebral fracture assessment. We also look at a hip geometry. We also look at a trabecular bone score. So, of course, most of them come, we all know, in endogenous Cushing, we find a significant osteoporosis. At least if they have mild fracture, we'll wait for if the treatment is definitive curative therapy of Cushing, then we can wait with calcium and vitamin D. Otherwise, we err on giving bisphosphonate because if there is a moderate to severe fracture, definitely it is going to fracture for some time. So we tend to err on bisphosphonate. Not anabolic very often. We have used in few cases.
Okay. So there is an interesting question regarding management of osteoporosis in Turner's syndrome from Dr. Avinash Patil. I think that opens again. It's another topic, and here there are multiple interplay factors like whether growth hormone has been supplemented, at what age gonadal hormones have been supplemented, and the decision cannot be taken based on only Turner syndrome. It has to be a conscious decision making, adjustment of the bone density for the height, because a lot of Turners end up remaining short. So till 16 or 18 years, you can use a Molgard approach or a Warner model to just get a corrected BMD. And more often than not, till that time, they will not need a, bone protective treatment. Then till peak bone mass is achieved, if the person has received HRT, that is not a question. And again, more often than not, HRT gets continued till 45. But what is more often needed is assessment of the bones, because Turner's is an independent risk factor for osteoporosis. Assessment of a bone density and adjusting the BMD for the height, because at least in Indian patients with Turner's, sometimes there is a height factor even in adults that does play a spoil sport. And there was a JCM article that gave a formula for adjusting BMD to height, and probably in such cases where the stature is short, it makes sense to do that. I'll invite comments from sir on that.
I agree with you.
for the benefit of all, I have again put the ISBMR membership link. There is, if you just Google ISBMR membership form, you get that page easily. It's an Indian Society of Bone Mineral Research. And me and Dr. Paul sir will request all of you to become members.
I think all of us, many of from West Bengal are already members, and I should congratulate Dr. Thomas Pal and the entire team to be very prompt. Actually, I applied for membership on just before Good Friday. The next day was a holiday, and I got my documents within just 72 hours. So you are super prompt. So thank you. I think, Silima, can you now wind
sir.
up thanking our
Yes, sir.
faculty?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much to our chairperson, speaker, and our audience for this beautiful discussion. Thank you very much, ESB. Now we have an announcement that is on the 21st of May. We have with us Dr. Riaz Ares from Tiruvandhapuram, who will be speaking on craniopharyngioma. And it is going to be chaired by Dr. Sambit Das from Bhubaneswar. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amir, Doctor.
Thank you everyone for inviting us here, and stay safe.
Thank you. Good night. Stay safe, all of you.
Good night, sir.
Good night, sir.